Get back. Yes, that's right. I am your host, Jeff Mader, here at Super Mader Bros Podcasting, covering Get Back Part 1. Joined as always by my brother, Dave Mader. Dave, how are you?
Whatever it is that will please you, Jeff, I'll do it. Okay, just leave me be. Like I'll play or I won't play, or I'll talk or I won't talk. Whatever it is.
I always feel like I'm annoying you, but I'm not. I'm trying to say, look, lads. And the other lad we have with us tonight, Josh Shields, another huge Beatles fan. Josh, how are you?
I'm good, Jeff. How are you?
Good, good. Excited to talk about part 1 here of the
Me
Get
too.
Back Beatles. Peter Jackson has brought back all the lost footage from the Let It Be Get Back sessions. As a Beatles fan, just right off the bat, this is like an early Christmas gift. Just to see all this footage, all this content, to be blasted back into this time period of January 1969. As a Beatles fan, as a historian, I couldn't really ask for anything more than this footage. So I'm very thankful to Peter Jackson for that. But first takes here, I mean, okay, that's there are 3 parts. This is part 1, and they're about 2.5 hours each part. And so if you're not a super duper uber fan, I could see how these dragged on. Dave, did you feel that way?
Yes, Jeff. Like I know Peter Jackson, I think deserves a lot of credit for what he did here with this documentary footage from what it was originally the Get Back, I guess, documentary, then became the Let It Be documentary, and now it's the Get Back. It's Get Back to Get Back. I suppose, right? And so I'm impressed with like how he's taken a lot of the audio material and then like kind of used like frames from the documentary to sort of create the illusion that this is like live footage of them speaking it. Even it is, but it isn't. However, I do think that like if you're going to do like a mini series like this, to break this into 3 parts, I think is sort of maybe not ideal. I think that you could have broken this into 10 parts or 6 or something just to cut this down. I think that narratively I understand why, because I think that he sees like sort of these different stages of this, how these sessions went, how this like 14 days went, and how he wants to tell this story. So he chose to break it up here. But I think a little bit on the long side.
Yeah, he kind of like this first part is kind of the Twickenham stage, because they basically got this stage space where I think where they filmed the Hey Jude music video, and it basically what's going on here is Ringo is going to go be shooting a movie at the end of the month. And they basically need to rehearse and come up with 14 songs for a live show by the end of the month because Ringo's going to have to go shoot this movie. So they basically put themselves into this position to really, which I don't think they needed to do, but they felt they needed to do. Josh, did you think that this was unnecessary? Did you think like, why did they put this timeline on their heads? Like what was the purpose of that? Do you think that's what generates creativity and that's what brings out the best of them? Is that how you look at it?
I mean, from my own perspective, I think as a famous procrastinator, it's not a bad thing to put pressure on yourself. I think they obviously had a lot of issues with the White Album where they were kind of all doing their own thing, and this was, I assume, a way to try to force themselves to work together.
Yeah.
I think it's crazy that, this, at least the first half of this first episode, they're spending so much time talking about this live show and arguing over where they're going to do it. Meanwhile, they haven't even written the songs that they're supposed to be singing. Like, to me, that's nuts. Now we're at a, time where you can buy tickets for a concert a year ahead of time before it even happens. And this is 2 weeks out and they don't even know if or where it's going to happen. And obviously, spoiler alert, it's not going to happen. This is not, I'm not spoiling anything that didn't happen.
What?
But yeah.
This ended on a cliffhanger, Josh. Like, are the Beatles going to break up here or what's happening? Like, it said that this meeting didn't go so well at Ringo's house at the lunch.
Next time on Get Back. Exactly.
Continue.
But John had actually a quote that I'm sure Peter put in there on purpose, where he says something like, put me under the gun, and that's when I'm at my best. And maybe that's part of the reason they did it this way, is because they know that at least in the state he was in when this was being filmed, John Lennon wasn't going to do much unless he was kind of forced to do it with a really tight timeline. And obviously it sort of worked out. Whether or not you think Let It Be is a good album, I mean, most people didn't at the time. I think it's aged pretty well, though.
I think that's exactly why it is a short timeline, and what's going on here is it has everything to do with John. Um, I think it also has a little bit to do with George, but a lot. I think John was hard to wrangle in these days to get to even to get him to even come to the studio and get them to actually work with him was hard because he. All right, for the just a little context here, at this time he's a heroin addict. With him and Yoko, it's widely known that he was doing heroin. At the same time, he had just broken up not that long before with his wife Cynthia, his first wife, and is so he's like in the midst of like this transition with Yoko. He's about to marry her in like a few months, I think by the end of like April or May. So it's not that long from now. So he's they're in that honeymoon love phase with each other and they don't ever want to leave each other's side, which I can understand. But at the same time, he's like in this band. So he's kind of like at a crossroads here. And so I can understand why it was hard to get him to do anything. But it's also, I think he's going through a lot of turmoil personally in his personal life as well. Dave, do you think that this is kind of what brings out the best in music is all this, like, especially a lot of tragedy, turmoil, kind of just it stirs it up in you, and that's what we get these great songs, and then you kind of get somebody like a Paul who is such a good musician, a musician's musician, and kind of is able to wrangle John's energy, and I think you kind of see that at least in this first hour, a couple hours of footage.
Yeah, like it's kind of complex because I think it's kind of the answer is yes and no. That it's kind of like I was thinking watching this, I'm like, this is almost cruel what they did here. They're like, okay, yeah, Ringo has to start shooting a movie at the end of January, so therefore we have to do this in like 2 weeks, very specifically, and it's very tight. And I think for like Paul, it's great, because Paul's just Mr. Energy, go, go, go. I got to write songs, and if this is going to get John going too, then even better. And he's also just like, I think Paul feels like it's up to him to sort of keep everything together. But I think for John and where he is in his life, it's bad. I think it's not good for George specifically. Like, I don't think he's really I don't think he's writing his best songs on this album. I think his songs like I Me Mine and these other things he has in here are fine, but they're not like, it's not his like best work. I think that for Paul, it's really good because you're just seeing is like, I got energy. I don't know what to do. I'm just going to write Get Back right now. Jojo was, he just writes a new song, like just like out of his head. Right. Like, so like, I think for him, it's good. And I don't even know, I didn't know all that about John specifically being on heroin at this time. So like, I'm even retroactively kind of thinking about that. But what I was really getting from the whole thing was that John and Paul weren't really in conflict. It didn't feel like it here. It's like it's all seems to be on George and Paul seems to be the conflict of the band.
I think a lot of the John and Paul stuff is like, don't piss John off too much because I think John has this like he's easy to piss off, and I think they know better and they kind of always keep it light. You notice they're always joking with him. At least that's how I kind of view it, and then he'll come in and he'll say something kind of cutting and it will really piss off like a George. And like Josh, did you notice any of that with John? Like the kind of like you can see he's almost fragile, I feel like, throughout these first couple hours.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's at this point in his life, he's got a lot of other issues. The Beatles aren't his number one priority, and he's kind of there out of a sense of obligation. And yeah, he's like that one friend that everyone has where once they've had a couple drinks, you don't want to say anything too upsetting to them because they're just going to like lose it and have a meltdown. And I think they all kind of realize that John's like that all the time at this point. It was very interesting for me to see, like at the very end, kind of leading up to George walking out, where it's not the way that, at least from the quotes I've read, that George Harrison spun it, that kind of John was sitting there spaced out and Paul was going on and boring us and, making us play Maxwell's Silver Hammer over and over. To me, it almost seemed like, Paul and John were actually vibing there and they were kind of getting back some of that old magic. And that's bringing George back to the early days of the Beatles where he didn't do much creatively. And I feel like he's sort of, he's kind of sitting there waiting for his turn on the ride. to play with one of his songs. Meanwhile, John and Paul are having the time of their lives, like, you know, figuring out how to write these songs. And George is kind of like, okay, I'm still here, guys. Like, you know, you said I would have a chance to help in this album, and you guys write your songs together, and then I go home and write a new song by myself, and then you guys don't care about it.
Yeah, that's exactly. I agree with that immensely because what and all the okay. So George has gone to America just before this in '68. He's hanging out in Woodstock. He went to go meet Bob Dylan. Um, a lot of what's going on with George is like he's learning. He's really a huge fan of the band at this time. That's why he's playing "I Shall Be Released," which is a Bob Dylan song, but famously played by the band. And he's starting to kind of jam in his own way, and he's like, okay, he's got all these songs, but they're all kind of slower songs. And like you see in this first couple hours, I think John says to him at one point, like, what are you doing playing that waltzy shit? Like, you know, that's not a rocker or a rock band. Like he says stuff like this, and George says, I don't give a fuck if you take it, play it or not. I don't care. You know, he's kind of like just kind of he's just had he's mopey, but he's just had enough of like both Paul and John always getting their way in the band. And George Martin also says something that's related to that. I feel like when he says, well, you know, John and Paul are a team. And then I think Dennis O'Dell or maybe it's Glenn says to him is like, well, but they kind of like right on their own now. Like they're not really like a team. And he's like, no, but they are. Right. Like he's like, you mean for like publishing purposes? He's like, yes. You know, so like you can tell how much George Martin is very involved still in like he's not even producing this album, by the way, guys. It'll end up being Phil Spector. He's just there, you know, but he's like
consultant.
He's still so involved with the Beatles as far as like what they're doing, how they're doing it, who's considered the writing. Like, why couldn't, you know, John and George write a song together? It was like almost like they weren't allowed to. And, you know, like, or they didn't want to, or maybe you're right. Like Josh, maybe it was like John and Paul, just like, we're the team and that's it. And, you know, Dave, how do you kind of take, you know, go off?
Yeah, John is or George is definitely sort of odd man out here. It feels like, you know, he's not there. Like I feel like even though John's the one with all these other issues, it seems to be that George is cranky and George doesn't want to be a team player. And I think that what else, like Ringo doesn't seem to care. Ringo's like, I'm here to play drums. I'm the Winston of this Ghostbusters. Like I'm here for the paycheck, and I go and I don't care. So all the squabbling among the other three, he doesn't seemingly take much interest in. I don't know if that's accurate.
I think he doesn't say a word for like other than he talks to Dennis O'Dell about the movie he's going to be shooting in a few weeks, and he even says to him, "Oh, this won't take 2 weeks." You know, he thinks it'll take 9 days. Like, you know, so like Ringo thinks it's going to be even faster than 2 weeks that they'll bust these 14 songs out.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different parts of this that I'm not necessarily like quite understanding. Like, I don't know if the cameras are on is having an effect either. You know, that is because we hear like off, like Paul tells us like, well, Ringo's the one who doesn't want to go to that desert place by the sea or whatever.
Libya. Yeah.
In Libya to do the show, right?
Does anybody else feel like that would have been a really stupid thing to do? Like this director pushing this amphitheater in the desert. Like I wanted to punch that guy in the face by halfway through this episode. Every single conversation. Yeah, he was bringing it back to that. Like, oh, you need to go to the washroom? Well, guess where they have nice washrooms? In Libya. Like, let's go. Like, he's always bringing it back.
All right,
he must own shares in this place or something.
I don't want to spoil it, but in the second part, George Harrison literally shits all over this idea, and it's amazing. So,
it's horrible. They're the Beatles. They don't need to play in this crazy like, you know, place. It's about them and the music and the fans. There's also a lot of really bad symbolism with a bunch of like British guys going down to like the former colonies to like bring their music and culture and play in the Middle East, you know what I mean, or Africa. It I don't know. It seems so crazy to me that might have happened.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, they seem to kind of have all these big ideas, but they didn't. It's the '60s too. It's like they keep going for something new and different and original, and they get, you know. So I understand why they were thinking that way, but then logistically, they were thinking, oh, we're gonna have to buy a big boat and take all of our fans on this giant boat and drive it to Libya so we could have all the fans there, because we can't have Libyan fans because none of them will understand what we're saying.
Yeah,
So
park the boat in the harbor at Liverpool
Wait.
and play on the boat if you want a boat. Like, why do you have to go anywhere?
yeah.
Yeah, okay. And so like that there's I'm not as much of like a Beatles historian as maybe you two are. And so like with this whole thing about like they give us the whole first, I don't know, 10 minutes or so is all like this sort of like background information. I think Peter Jackson wanted this series to be accessible to the non-Beatles fan too. However, if you didn't know anything about the Beatles before this, I don't know if you would enjoy this. Like, just, how this is like, seems like something that a super fan would be more into, but it gives all this background. Okay, they Beatlemania and Brian Epstein and all this background on him, and then how they were like, okay, no more touring. We're only going to make like these psychedelic albums now, and we're going to get more creative in the studio. And then Epstein dies, and they explain that they formed this new company, Apple, and that Apple is the their managers. And then, but like what I also get from this is like, who's in charge exactly creatively, or who's leading this? Because it seems like Apple is just run by a bunch of dopes. Like every time that manager guy was talking about Libya, I was like, this guy needs to shut up. Everything he says is bad. And then
that was the director of
Yeah, he's the director of the movie.
Michael Lindsay Hogg, who also directed like the Paperback Writer video. He directed the Hey Jude video. He directed Rain. Like he did a lot of their music videos back in the day. That's why he was tapped to do this.
Okay, well,
he just wanted something cool on his reel, like, oh, we're in an amphitheater in whatever, Libya. Like, I don't like that guy at all.
Yeah, he's an artsy fartsy filmmaker in the 1960s, and he had a lot of big ideas that were stupid. And even the Beatles, who wanted to create something big here, were like, no, So, and rightfully so, because again, there's a lot going on personally with these guys. These guys aren't the Beatles from 1965 that are like wearing the tight suits and are traveling the world and are they've been in England for like 2 years straight, basically, and have not left, have not toured, have not gone in front of a live audience. Like I think Paul even says at one point, like,
but in the background, they do say that they haven't done like a live show, but they did do like the Hey Jude music video or whatever. And there was a group of people there that all get up on stage and whatever. And they were, oh, we liked that, so we want to do something. And it seems like these Apple people, the people that work for them, their managers and whoever, are sort of trying to like, let's get you in front of a crowd again, because you guys are getting a little bit too maybe introverted or something. I feel like is what they're thinking of. Like, I feel like the Beatles are sort of being pushed back out by these people.
And apparently, like according to the dialogue in here, it's actually John is the person that wants to go in front of an audience. Which is kind of odd to think when you think about it, because he's the one with the most going on personally, I think. And the rest of them, like Paul especially, I don't think they want to go perform right now. They kind of want to like bust out their songs because they have all these ideas and they have these songs in their head, and they want to keep those fresh so they can get them recorded. Which I can understand. Josh, like, what do you think? Like, do you think they're all kind of going different directions here? Like George is like his heart's in India, Paul's his heart's in the studio, John wants to go do a live show, and Ringo wants to make a movie. Is that about right?
Yeah, like they all have different priorities. None of their top priority is the Beatles, except maybe Paul. But like Ringo, yeah, he's trying to get into films because the other Beatles have done that. At least Paul and John, I know John for sure had done some movies at the time. John just cares about Yoko at this point and drugs probably. So yeah, they're all kind of doing their own thing. And going back to this director guy, what's his name, Michael Lindsay Hogg.
Yeah.
How many times in this episode does he say, I don't want to say that you owe it to the fans because you don't, but I feel like we really owe it to the fans to put on like one last show. And again, I think he's just trying to, make a name for himself with this video. He's trying to persuade them to do something that I don't think any of them want to do. Like even John, who wants to do the show, I think he's the one who keeps saying, why don't we just do it here? Like it can be intimate. Like it doesn't need to be some crazy thing. So I don't know. And I think it makes sense that John wants to do it. I think he's not the guy who wants to sit there in the studio every day like this for, other albums take, months, not weeks. I think he'd rather do it this way. You get it done in a few weeks, you record the show, and then he's done with his album, and he's probably planning on leaving the Beatles, right?
Yeah, it's been kind of reported that he right around here he kind of softly leaves the Beatles, but he agrees to stick around to finish their songs for Abbey Road, because Let It Be is, even though it's the last album that was released, it was actually, these songs were done first, and that's why there are some Abbey Road songs that are being recorded here and being kind of worked out here, like Maxwell Silverhammer, that they will record later. But it's pretty kind of acknowledged that he was looking to leave before then. They kind of knew that. You can see it on their faces in a lot of different scenes where, like, Paul, at one point, like when George leaves, he goes, and then John Lennon doesn't show up. He kind of says, like, you could see tears in his eyes, and he says, then there were two, with, meaning him and Ringo. And you can kind of see, the writing on the wall, like in Paul's face. Like, he knows that, like, this isn't working and this is coming to an end, and it's mostly because of John and of what's going on with John at the time. So, and it's not really, they're kind of letting John's like speak for himself, as far as like who he is and what's going on. They're not really giving us a lot of context to him, I find, but they are with George and they are with Paul. But with John, like just like months before, like the whole breakup of his marriage, that, none of that is discussed in the opening prologue, where they go through the whole history of the Beatles.
Like they're going through like 15 years of history, like in a couple minutes, right? So there's a lot like that gets left out here. But what I definitely got, like, just observing John in this first part, it was like, well, he's kind of longing for the old days, because he keeps coming. He's like just like playing like these old songs like from the TV shows or whatever, and then he would just play. He was like, let's play that song we used to open up on stage with, like, maybe he's missed like
rock and roll music.
I guess he's the one. Yeah, he's missing the rock and roll feel, being in front of a crowd, having everyone cheer for him, and then Paul here wants to write like oobla dee oobla da, and like these very stylistically different songs from what John really writes. But I think, like, to the business aspects, the more songs that they pump out here in like the next couple months on Let It Be and Abbey Road, the more money he's going to make long term, the more like financially stable he'll be for the future, and he knows it, right? So I think he's like, okay, I'm going to like put my head down and try to get through this. Although I think Paul's not impressed with his contributions in through most of this, right? Because he goes, "Have you written anything?" And he goes, "Nope."
Yeah,
I don't.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
don't know if Paul minds that. I don't know if Paul minds that much. I think Paul likes writing as much as he can. Like, one thing that I found interesting about the way, like, at least what we saw here, and I'm sure it's, something that's, I've suspected before. I'm not like a super Beatles historian type person, but when Paul's writing some of these songs, he's kind of got the music down, and he's got like a few of the, like, he's got the chorus, or he's got a few of the lines, and then he's kind of filling in with just like blah blah blah, like he's just making up words and he's adding in the lyrics later. Whereas, for example, John, like with Across the Universe, he's basically said, I wrote this song to be like a poem. The music isn't what matters, it's the lyrics. And I find a lot of, especially his later songs, it's almost like John's like a rapper. Like, he kind of comes up with these complex lyrics with complex meanings and then fills in the song, whereas Paul writes the music first and then fills in the words. And I think that might be why they worked so well together earlier on, and maybe why their music's so different later on. Like, it's interesting because their songs are so distinct from each other, especially like, White Album and Let It Be and Abbey Road. Like, their songs are really different at that point.
And a great example of what you're talking about, Josh, is definitely the song "Give Me Some Truth." When they're working on that, like, they're like, "Oh, let's run through that," because he said John had that song, and all of a sudden, Paul remembered it better than John did. Like, he just starts like, money for rope, right? And he starts doing all that stuff, and then John's like, "Oh yeah, I got the lyrics." Like, so I think you're right. Like, John, I think a lot of the time Paul has the melody or has the chord progression, and then John would fill in the lyrics and would change the lyrics up of what Paul would originally write, and then that's kind of how it worked, and that was the chemistry.
Like, I also thought like John, like watching this tonight, like John's a bit of like a like, he's just got his head in the clouds, I guess is the only way I can put it. Like, when he's talking to that producer guy, like the guy who owns Twickenham, he's like, "Where do we get all like these plastic boxes, like boxes of plastic, and we stack them all over the place, and we could do different shapes?" And I'm just like, what are you talking about, John Lennon? Like, what are you going on about? you know, and then he's got like Yoko Ono with him all the time, which is like a whole other thing. Like in this, like I was watching with Jane, and she's like, "Yeah, this is uncomfortable." Like she makes this uncomfortable, and I was like, I have to imagine he's acting different with Yoko here, right? Like, is that what's happening? Like they're seeing him as a different person, where they can't approach him the same way. So he's kind of they don't make eye contact with her most of the time, and you know, so she's just kind of like on there.
Yeah, she's the Beatles broke up because she sat on an amp. Yeah, like that's kind of the famous line that Paul says, here. And was she a big reason for why the band broke up? No, I don't think so. But at the same
No.
time, you're 100% right, Dave. It's weird that she's just like hanging out while they're like busting through songs, and like she doesn't need to be right beside him. Like she can but she wants to be. But like at the same time, the band is like, I don't know.
I didn't bring my wife.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. They Linda shows up, who I don't think's married to Paul yet at that point, but they're married a few months later, and Olivia's there, who's George's. No, sorry,
Patty.
Yeah, sorry, Patty's not there. Olivia's there, who's Ringo's wife. Right. But they're there on like the Friday before the weekend.
Yeah, they're only there sometimes.
They're only there like one day. They're not. But I think honestly, Yoko, the whole she broke up the Beatles, that's not true. I think she's like a symptom of John's problems that broke up the Beatles. Like John, it was a very Jeff, you said that earlier. He was a very volatile person. I think the fact that she's around him all the time is because he probably had a lot of trust issues. He didn't really want to almost like let her out of his sight. Like, he was a notorious cheater. He probably assumed she's going to do that. He's just kind of dragging her everywhere he goes. And yeah, I don't know. I felt bad for her.
I think it's even deeper than that. I think it's like with John, there's a lot of tragedy that surrounded him. Like his mother died when he was 15, when he just reconnected with her. Stuart Sutcliffe died, like, when the Beatles were just getting going. Like there was just a bit of his dad left him. Like he was an orphan. He was all these different things with him where it just never went his way personally. And the only thing that seemed to be his anchor was the Beatles. But then the whole thing with Cynthia happened with Yoko, where I don't know if you guys know that story, but basically Cynthia left on like a trip, and like I believe Paul introduced John to Yoko, and like he went to this thing at a museum and met her and then invited her back. And then Cynthia actually knew about that part, but then she left, and then like she came back and then like found them naked in the, like, that's when the whole two virgins thing happened. Like, and then the only thing he said was like, "Oh, hi," like when she walked in the door, so like, there's this whole wasn't me, or was me, but sorry, but basically is what happened with him. And so this is only like 6 months before this, like it's not a long period of time. The Beatles really, like, the thing I really noticed about all four of them, especially John and Paul, like they seem so much older than their ages. Like here, like Paul is only 26 here, and John is 28. Like,
right. And Ringo's 28, right?
Yeah, and that George is 25.
25. Yeah, that's the whole thing. Is like they're crazy young here, right? And like I'm older than they are now, or I'm older now than they were then. That's what
we all are. Yeah.
Yeah, we all are, right? But significantly, but like some of them, like when they show that Brian Epstein dead at 32, I'm like, that guy's not 32.
I'm 32 right now.
Like Epstein looks like he's about 48, when he died. But he was 32 apparently, like Mr. Epstein. And John in particular, I don't think he's just a kind of a strange looking guy, I think. But like Paul looks like a baby. George kind of. Ringo.
It's not how much they look. It's like the way they act. Like they're so mature. I find for the way, like, they're so lived. I wouldn't use the mature adjective, but they seem like they've really lived in like a 6-year period since they were like 20 years old.
It's ridiculous how short of a time like the Beatles were together. Like when you think about like, oh, they have all these albums, they had all this success, but at the very start of the first episode, like, oh, 1956, like John Lennon's 15 and they're starting a band. I'm like, wait, they go from 15-year-old kids starting a band to like 12 years later, the band's broken up. They're all like on drugs or whatever. They've all been divorced. They've had like their manager, well, not their whatever Brian Epstein was, their showrunner, essentially, like probably kill himself. They've had, members,
Yeah.
you mentioned Stu Sutcliffe earlier, like leave the band and die like 2 months later. Like,
Yeah.
it's crazy how much shit happened in 12 years. Like 12 years is not a long time. Like I
Yeah.
remember 12 years ago, I'm like, oh, that was like, 2000, that was 5 years ago. You know what I mean? Like
12 years ago was 2009.
yeah, exactly.
Like think about like we started first going to Vashel events, Jeff, like back in the day. Like that's about that length of time. It's not insignificant, but like they have some city miles. Like they're kind of unique. Like they kind of know that they're these different kind of people that like are the most famous people in the world in many ways, the biggest band, but they feel this immense pressure like to compete, I think, to be like keep up with like bands like the Rolling Stones. They mentioned like Billy Preston and their other contemporaries that they feel like, we got to keep going. Like you guys just need to take like a couple months off or a couple of years off even and just come back to it. But I think Paul just couldn't stop. I think that John, I don't know, like he seems burnt out and just wants to do his own thing and just doesn't want to.
They tried to do like holidays. They went to India for like a month or something like that. But like they tried to kind of do it, but they needed to do like a longer break. They really did. Like after they toured and then they went into the studio, they never stopped. They never really took a good break. And so I think that was kind of also a part of their detriment, was because Paul, I think you're right, Dave, is the workaholic in the Beatles by far. Like he is the guy that's like, come on, lads, we'll get it going. And
come on, we'll write about 14 songs in 10 days. Let's do it.
Well, he made a comment at the start of the episode where he's like, I hate being the boss. And I don't think that's him trying to be like, oh, I'm the boss now. I think it's literally like Brian Epstein's gone. I'm the one like trying to make things happen with this band, and I hate this role because I have to be the bad guy, right? Like they were the kids, and they had Brian, their like dad, to corral them, and now Paul has to do that, and it's
he has to be like Matthew Fox on Party of Five, right? Like the parents are dead, and he's like the oldest. He's not, even though he's not the oldest, but he's kind of like the one. It's almost like the dad died, and then there's 4 brothers, and like one of them's like, okay, lads, we got to pull it together. And we got to like, do this, right? They can even talk about that. They're like, when he died, like there's now no one to kind of tell us to wear suits and to get up there and do it. And so now I'm the one doing it, but I don't, this is Paul. Paul doesn't want to be the one to have to do it, but there's no one else.
And that also has to do a lot with what's going on with John. John was the boss, the leader of the band. And now Paul was like, secondary boss. And then George is like, George and Ringo are kind of like, especially at the beginning of the Beatles, the help, and then George becomes his own thing as he becomes a really, really good songwriter. Are all of them still alive? No, John is dead, and so is George. Both of those guys are. John
Lennon died a long time ago. He died before I was born.
Yeah, he died before all of us were born.
George's pretty recent. Again, 2001 doesn't seem that long ago. I remember when it happened.
20 years ago. He's been for 20 years.
Yeah. I remember when it happened. I was like, "Oh, the Beatles! I know that." My parents like had a bunch of albums of those guys, and they have good music. I think I was 13.
It just good. Yeah, it just goes to show, though, Josh. Like, I was the same. Like, I remember I was watching Star Trek one day. It was 2000. I think it was November 2001, and all of a sudden, like the news came on. It was like, "Oh, George Harrison is dead," and I was like, "Oh, I had no idea. I had no idea who the Beatles were." I was 10 years old. And that's when I started getting into the Beatles about a year after that. And then I've been a fan ever since. But it's amazing how timeless these guys' music is, like it never seems dated. Everything with them, like there's not a single song really that comes across like, oh, that doesn't work anymore. Like all of them are just
Maggie May.
Well, Right. Well, Maggie.
They have these little short interlude songs that are just really weird, or like Piggies on the White Album. Like, you're just like, what are they doing? This is fun, but come on, this would never work now.
Yeah. No, well, I see what you're saying. Like, yeah. Well, that was the other thing I wanted to kind of bring up is like, this kind of shows like how the music industry kind of chews up and spits bands out. And this is kind of like the documentary to me that shows you the biggest band in the world, what the music industry kind of did to these guys, like they kind of these especially John, Paul, and George were like best friends for like a long time, and they got to like the end of a road here where they're bickering with each other. They're getting to a point where, they're doing drugs. Their personal lives are kind of in turmoil. Like, I believe at the same time, George is having a lot of problems with his wife, Patty. So you have that going on. You have the John and Yoko thing, and then you have Paul. Had just recently broken up with Jane Astor and is now with Linda Eastman. So that is the crazy thing that's going on with the Beatles. Is there's so much accumulated, and they're trying to hold it all together with no manager. And at the same time, they're like, hey, what would be a good idea? Let's document this.
You're recording our conversations, are you? Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. It's cool though. Like you guys you touched on at the very start, Jeff, how it's like as a historian, like I think it's cool. Like even with They Shall Not Grow Old, Peter Jackson's like first big documentary using original footage. Like we're now in an age where things that we have on camera, we have recordings, are history now. Like this Beatles, Let It Be movie, when it came out, it wasn't history yet. It was just a documentary from the time. But now we're like, what, 50 years later, more than 50 years later, we're watching like one of the most famous bands of all time just hanging out. Like that's cool. Like we're like this is access. You it's not like we had cameras in the room like when Alexander was planning his like conquests of Persia, things like that. Like we're actually seeing these cool things happen. Like we can watch them. It's cool. It's
definitely cool.
It's an original source.
That was the whole allure. Like, I've seen a lot of this original documentary, and like, never in this quality. Like once they were showing the promos, and you're like, oh wow, that's Paul McCartney, and he looks like it's right. It looks like it's right now. It looks like if you're watching it on like a good quality television, you're like, oh, okay, hey, there's Paul. Like I can really like look back at these people from like the times before I was born, where I was like, because the TV quality and frame rates weren't as good back then. They always seemed like so ancient, like the 60s, the 70s. It was like even like some parts of the 80s, which I lived through, but
it wasn't that long ago. And like Josh is right with Peter Jackson's World War I thing. Like you go and watch that, which is like 100 years ago. And to see that in HD is even kind of spookier because like you're like, whoa, this is like actually like being there. And it's the same here. Like you're right though. Like if you go and put the Let It Be documentary side by side with some of this footage, it's night and day. Like it really is. And it's really interesting how, like you're right, like it places you in the room. Yeah. And you kind of get to really see like, oh, that's what John Lennon was really like. Because we don't really, other than interviews, have this. Right. And that's why it's such a present for an early Christmas present for Peter Jackson to give us this. Because like, I don't know, I'm just a huge fan of the band, but also like these people. And like, I don't know, do you feel that way, Josh, too? Like, do you kind of like go, oh man, it's just cool to see these people be them and not have to like, it's not an interview. It's like a choreographed answer they gave, or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. It's like we talked about earlier. They're younger than we are now, and we're looking at them, and you can kind of see them as like a person. Like they're these young kids essentially who have become super famous and super rich, and they're trying to like make this thing work, and it's not working. It again, like I hate to bring an analogy to like a different genre, but it's like watching like a sports documentary. Like there was recently like that whole Toronto Maple Leafs thing on Amazon Prime, where one, you see these players do interviews and they're just completely rehearsed, completely like cardboard. It's boring. Then you watch something like this where it's somewhat staged and it's not really real. Like, yeah, it's a documentary behind the scenes, but they're all super aware of what's going on. This is like another degree removed, whereas yeah, these guys know this is in the room, like John and Paul and Ringo and George know there's cameras in the room, but you can tell they're not on their guard the whole time. And that's what makes it so cool. And I don't even know if that is realistic now without literally hiding cameras, which is, unethical. I think everyone is so aware of the fact that you could be filmed at any time because of cell phones, that this is like a snippet in history where something like this was possible to get like a truly candid
Yeah, it wouldn't
video
happen
of this.
now, exactly, Josh, because people are sort of aware more of that kind of thing and a little bit more paranoid, turning their head. And back then, Paul kind of jokes like, "Well, one day we'll be like, this will be a whole TV show. Like the whole thing here will be a TV show. Can you imagine, right? John's like, I'll
I'd be
remember
like,
that.
yeah, TV.
Um, but like it's like the whole idea like of the reality TV and kind of watching celebrities up close and kind of doing whatever that didn't really exist yet. That was decades away. So yeah, they are so much more relaxed, and to watch them work creatively, like to write these songs and go, what about this? What about that? It's kind of just really interesting. Like you would never get this. Like where else are you going to get something like this? What other kind of band or artist has a documentary quite like this? I can't think of one right off the top of my head. It's unique.
Yeah, I really wish like other bands did this. I wish we had Rolling Stones or the band or the Who, or just to kind of see the process of how they wrote songs in the studio, how they figured it out, how they kind of who was in charge of what as far as melodies, lyrics, because it'd just be cool to watch that stuff. But the one thing I will say about, like, yes, they are aware of the cameras, but at the same time they own Apple, and Apple is making this documentary, and so they know they're gonna have final cut. And that's the other thing that is changing here. Before they were very they beholden to EMI and George Martin, and you can see that this is the time where like they're now the bosses. But like it's like, I don't know, they're a little too young.
They're late 20s. Like they're very inexperienced still, and they have no business training.
Right. They even say that a lot. Like, we had no idea what we were doing, business wise and music business wise, especially. And they wanted to, like, this Apple company they started was to do movies and film, and it was TV shows and music, and they were gonna they were trying to get all these different artists, including like James Taylor and all these different people, to come in and record under their label. And it's just like, can't you guys just like figure out like your songs? But the thing is, they didn't want to be beholden to EMI anymore. And so I get it. I understand like what was going on, but at the same time, like, man, they pile a lot on their shoulders, I think, unnecessarily. Josh, what do you kind of make of like do you think they're just worn out here? Like, and Paul is just like is the only one who's not worn out, and the others are just kind of over it,
Well, I don't even know if it's like that Paul's not worn out. I think Paul just might have a little, at this point in his life, a little more not mental capacity, but like he still cares about, I guess, making the music, or he gets that it's important. But I think there's the one scene with like George Martin and Paul, and they're talking about like buying sheet music, like rights to music, so they can sell sheet music, and like they're literally just, again, they're sort of aged beyond their years. They're all kind of thinking about now like their long-term financial well-being, their long-term business interests. And the idea that they've created this multimedia company in the 1960s that's doing film and television and bringing together stars, like they're like the original MCU. Like, this was like a good idea. It's just they were probably stretching themselves too thin based on, like you said, a lot of them are having a lot of personal issues. They're probably too young to be doing this. But I think it's it's really cool. Like, it makes me kind of feel shitty about myself that these guys are younger than me, and they're like, oh yeah, I'm over being like a world famous rock musician. Like, that's boring. Like, let's buy some rights to some music where we can make money for a long time selling sheet music to schools and stuff. Like, it's cool. It's interesting.
While at the same time writing some of the best pop songs ever written, while at the same time producing a documentary, while at the same time starting a label and starting a new recording studio, while at the same time setting up this whole thing at Twickenham while Ringo's going to go film a movie. Like there's just so much going on. And I've none of us will probably ever be celebrities and live the celebrity lifestyle, but even celebrities, I think, don't live this hectic of a schedule. I think they enjoy their lives at least a little bit. I think they work when they have to, and it's tough like for certain parts, but this is like nuts. Like, I think the drugs might have something to do with it. But Dave, like, what do you make of like their lifestyle? Like, because this kind of, to me, gives you a glimpse into their lifestyle here.
Yeah, a little bit, but like, it's not exactly like party hardy like rock and roll like you would think. It's like at one point he's like, hey, do you want a beer? I'll have a glass of wine.
Right.
You know, like they're smoking like chimneys, like they're chain smoking like you know, crazy, but like there's always somebody smoking. But like I didn't feel like they were pounding it. Now who's doing drugs you know, off camera? There's a lot of time we don't see here, right? You know, they're like, hey, we're going to lunch. What happened at lunch? You know, so it's but like I thought it was like they're pretty professional for the most part. I think, you know, considering their relative age here and like that they've sort of lived this crazy life already, and they're like, well, this is how we have to get through it. How many songs did they already written? You know, how many gold records do they already have at this point? You know, they know how to write a song. They know how to all of them, right? Like, it's so this it's just like it's like they're at a certain point where they're like, I guess did they have the motivation? Do they have the hunger? Do they have the drive? And that's kind of what this documentary. I think the who is the original filmmaker guy? You said his name
Michael
was?
Lindsay Hogg.
Yeah, I feel like to him, he was like, I'm making a documentary that's about the breakup of the Beatles, and even like Ringo's like, but you're just surmising that you don't know that we're just a bit cranky since Epstein died, you know.
Yeah.
Like I think the filmmaker's like, no, you guys are breaking up. I know it, and this is my moment. And that's why I want to film you in Libya.
Yeah, I kind of agree with both of you that the original filmmaker was not. He was good at shooting a music video, but I don't know what the hell they were thinking hiring him to do this documentary. I just think you're right. Like he had a lot of dumb ideas, and they had to kind of, you know, shoot him down and be like, all right, you can set up here and then we're going to come hang out and work some songs out. And, you know, I don't think they were going to, like, they had decided to break up here too. I think, he was almost willing that into existence.
It seemed like, well, you know, you had said that, or someone said earlier that John was like, I'm going to get out of here. Like, you know, he had already kind of given notice that he was eventually going to leave the Beatles within the year. And, you know, then George quits here in this episode too, right? Like, and so does he know that John was leaving and why quit here? And
well, I don't think he had told them yet, but it was like, well, it was kind of like understood that John has a lot going on, and I don't know if he really wants to be doing the Beatles long term. He has a famous quote that he said when he was like 20 or 21 years old. He's like, by the time I get to 30 years old, I won't be singing Love Me Do or She Loves You. I won't be doing Beatles songs. Is basically what he said. And so I think he knew that it was getting to that point. He was 28, going on 20, he'll turn 29 at the end of the year. He, I think, knew that he wanted to be done with the Beatles by the time he was 30. And I think he had told them a lot of the other Beatles that, you know, but it wasn't like a for sure thing, but it was like an idea that was definitely implanted in their heads, I think. But you know, and then you watch his body language. You watch kind of the way John is amongst them. Like he's always joking. He's not taking things, you know, super seriously. He only kind of goes like, "All right, I'm bringing my songs in," and then, but you know, and then Paul helps him work them out. But he's not really working them out with George. George is just like the help again. A lot of the times, I understand why George left because
because this whole thing to me is about George's frustrations, like how he's just like, you guys don't hear me, and then. And it seems like Paul's always trying to be fussy with him. He's like, no, don't play it like that. Play it like this or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a little brother dynamic. That's why it would have been interesting if Jake was here because we got like an older and a younger brother. But I feel like John and Paul are kind of used to just telling George, like, do this, do that. Oh, you wrote a song. Good job. Like, meanwhile, George goes off. And he goes out and hangs out with Eric Clapton and Bob Dylan, and they treat him like contemporaries. And they're like, oh, you're like one of the other great guitarists of our time. And he's like, well, yeah, I am the lead guitarist of the #1 band in the world, but I'm also like the third, you know, guy in the band,
right?
You know, out of 4. So I think
like everyone knows me last. Everyone knows, even they know Ringo more than me.
Yeah, when I was a kid, when George died, I was like, oh, like I know Paul McCartney because you know he was in The Simpsons, and I know John Lennon because he got killed, and I remember Forrest Gump. That's like a thing. And I knew Ringo Starr because he was on Shining Time Station.
Right.
And then I was like, oh, George Harrison, he's like the other one. And, you know, he's also the lead guitarist. That's crazy.
That's right. Ringo Starr and George Carlin shared the role of the conductor.
Right? That's crazy.
Yeah.
That is crazy. Two of the goats. I think you're right about that because like George also I think had a lot of amazing songs like just in his vault that they wouldn't even let him put on the White Album. And the White Album, was right before this, and I think that has a lot to do with it. Like he really got, I think he got like 4 songs on there or something, and not a lot of his good ones. And so like at the beginning of this, they start working on All Things Must Pass, and which is one of the best George songs, and it doesn't end up on a Beatles record, but it could have, But I think John and Paul and George Martin kind of kiboshed a lot of his ideas and his songs and didn't want to work on them. Like they didn't want to help him out as much too. Like I can understand why he felt that way, and a lot of it had to do with singing, I think, because like Bob Dylan, I've seen an interview with him talk about that before, where he's like, oh, how do you get songs past Lennon and McCartney? It's pretty hard to do. Like Paul's one of the best musicians ever, and John's one of the best singers ever, is what Bob Dylan said. And he's like, how are you gonna get a song on an album when you have those two guys?
Right.
Which I can understand.
Yeah, I guess it's like being on a really talented hockey team, and it's got Gretzky and it's got Lemieux, and well, I guess you're the third best. You're
Mitch Marner.
You're Brett Hull or something, right? Or you're whatever. Like you're great, but you're not as great as the next two there. And that's kind of why the Beatles were sort of like this amazing thing, is that they were so much talent that just came from kind of nothing, right? Like a bunch of teenagers playing in their garages and dungeons. And then Ringo came along. Ringo was kind of had his own path, right? But the three of them really are like siblings.
Yeah, John and George, Paul and George went to the same like grammar school. Like they literally knew each other since they were like 8 or 9 years old.
And they're basically a year apart, right? It's like, John's a year older than Paul and Paul's a year older than George.
Right, but like they didn't meet John until like John's older than him, but like he was like 16 and they were like 14 or something like that. So like it was a little bit later. Like John and Paul and George knew each other longer.
Right.
And so like and Paul basically brought George into the band once he met John. So like I agree with what Josh said, that he's like the younger brother, and it's like, I think there's a little bit of like, my partnership is with John,
not with you.
And like I don't want to say like, oh, you're lucky to be here, but it's kind of like, I helped you come into this band, you're world famous now, and it's a lot to do with the success of our partnership, John and Paul's partnership.
But he seems to think though that George's songs are inferior to his and John's.
I think John thinks that more than Paul does. Paul, I think, like likes to work on his songs, but at the same time, he's got all these other songs, that he's got to bust out. Like he comes up with "Get Back," he's got "Let It Be," he's got all these songs just in his vault of his head. And I think George also has all these songs, but they're very different. They're very slow. Like go listen to "All Things Must Pass." Like all those songs, like "Isn't It a Pity?" Like all those songs that he has are very slow and melancholy, and I think big time John was the one that kind of shot it down. But that's not what this documentary tries to portray to us. So you're right, Dave. They try to portray to us that Paul is the one that kiboshed a lot of George's stuff, which I don't necessarily think is completely true. I think he definitely did kibosh things, but I think also John did. John, it's like if it wasn't a rocker, I think John kind of was like, I don't know about this.
Right. Well, how much do you think got left out here, right? And do you think there were certain things that maybe John Lennon died in 1980 and George in 2001, so it's their respective like widows, right? Like Olivia Harrison and Yoko Ono, who have to speak on their behalf and would say, I do want this or I don't want this. Whereas Paul and Ringo are alive and they have direct license over what they would allow or not be allowed to kind of be shown here. And so Paul can say, don't show that about John. I'll make it more like I was me, or show the parts about me saying this, right?
I could 100% see that. I could totally see
Peter Jackson, please, you don't be disparaging of John's memory. This might really died.
I could see them
probably.
leaving out certain harshness of John towards George and stuff like that. I could see that because, yeah, they're both gone. They can't speak for themselves anymore. I saw an interview with Peter Jackson talking about. There's this whole thing where they're laughing about, there's an article about how. When you know how they have the meeting at Ringo's house and it says it doesn't go well, there's a whole story that those two got into a fist fight.
Ringo and who?
No, so John and George.
John and George did at
Yeah.
that. Okay.
That's the story, but Peter Jackson says he has I think it's in the second episode where they start talking about it and they start laughing about it because it wasn't true. And they start kind of like going like fisticuffs and they're like, "Oh, bring it here," because they're reading it in the newspaper. Like that was the story that was written about, right? And he was like, Peter Jackson said that it really upset him at first, like that was the story, but the two guys who can't speak to it are both gone. That he was so happy to learn that didn't happen. That was made up.
That was like a myth.
Yeah, they said the two guys who are alive.
Well, yeah, and says Peter Jackson. Yeah, and he said the most they ever fought was one time they were in Hamburg and John threw a piece of cake at George or something like that. It was like they threw food at him. So like that was the closest they ever came to like actual fisticuffs or something like that. But I don't know. I imagine there was a few arguments and pushing and shoving. I could see living that tight quarters for that.
I think like that's just gonna happen,
Yeah.
when young guys like that. Like if it was a hockey team or a band or whatever, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, exactly. The only other thing I wanted to put in that I was kind of thinking and watching the episode is I think a lot of the George wanting to feeling left out thing might just be like a personality thing. Like you talked about it earlier, it's like a partnership almost between John and Paul. I feel like when Paul writes a song, he's writing it thinking of him and John. And John writes a song, he's thinking of him and Paul. Whereas the way George writes songs, like I think he even said it in the episode when he was writing I, Me, Mine. He's like, oh, it's really nice because I can just like play it myself. I don't really need any backing. Like he's writing his own songs for himself to play, whereas the other guys are writing songs for the band. And that might be why they don't give it as much, they don't give him as much time for his songs because they kind of figure, oh, like George gets his own little George songs and that's what he wants.
This is what George is doing. I, me, mine, I, me, mine, I, me, mine.
And personally, I love that song. It's one of my favorites.
Where's my part? Where's this? Am I going to come with a big bass hook for I, me, mine?
Exactly. That's the thing. I think they don't realize how upset he is. I think they think he's content with what he has. And obviously that's not the case. I don't know.
And I think they do make a conscious effort to help him later on, like with I, Me, Mine, like the whole like chorus part where it goes I, me, mine. That was all, I believe that was Paul that helped him with that. So like I do think there was like some collaboration where they were like, okay, we should help George more with his songs. But the shame is, like, you're right, they focus too much on the Lennon McCartney tag, I think, and so I think they should have had more songs where they wrote with George, where they kind of helped him out, and not even to take credit or anything, but just to and they started to do it with I, Me, Mine and For You Blue with the slide guitar and stuff. But if they had helped him with some of the All Things Must Pass songs, I think they would have been even better, and they are really, really great songs. Did you guys enjoy, Dave? Did you enjoy them playing some of the old songs, like some of the like 50 songs? They play some Chuck Berry, they play some
I didn't enjoy it as much, but it was kind of like I was like, okay, this, I was like, you guys have a deadline, you have 14 songs to write in 2 weeks or whatever, get going. Don't be wasting your time. I was also like, no, maybe this is good. Maybe you guys, if you play this song, it will inspire you to write something else. I guess that's kind of why they were doing it too, just to sort of help clear their mind. But it's not, I like watching them kind of like write these, like, especially songs like Get Back and Don't Let Me Down, to see like those get like sort of written in real time. I think that was like the real gift. That's what I really enjoyed more than anything.
Yeah. And Josh, when we get to the kind of the end here, when they start talking about replacing George with Eric Clapton. I mean, especially John's the one that brings that up. Did they not just hear George talking about like his friend Eric and like what good friends he is with Eric Clapton, and like why did they think that would work?
So, I mean, the whole thing is crazy because like, as you may or may not know, I'm sure, Jeff, you probably do, like, Eric Clapton is obsessed with George Harrison's wife at the time, and he
Mm.
writes a song about her, Layla. And then eventually, I believe George splits with her amicably, and she ends up going and marrying Eric Clapton. And I think George even jokes that he's his husband-in-law or something after. Like, it's a whole thing, but it's really weird hearing George talk about his buddy who's obsessed with his wife. But I do remember reading a quote. Eric Clapton's been in the news a little lately for the wrong reasons, but I do remember reading a quote where he basically said, John Lennon always liked to make comments that they would just replace George with me, but I was friends with George, not with the other Beatles. I never would have actually done that. So I think this is just John Lennon talking out of his ass, honestly.
Like big plastic boxes to build a stage, and we'll
exactly.
move the
We'll just get George, or we'll just get Eric Clapton, whatever. Like, we'll just get the other, one of the other best guitarists.
We'll get Mick Jagger or whoever. He'll come over.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's just bluster. I think, yeah, he's John Lennon. He's on drugs at this time.
Yeah, the drugs are talking a little bit.
Not his sharpest, maybe.
Well, I think it's just like he's like insensitive, and he's not really like thinking things through. Like, like, how the hell are you going to convince Eric Clapton, the guy that's like best friends with the guitarist of your band that just left, to come play for your? Well, you're right. He wasn't going to do that. Like, I mean, it just made no sense to me. The other thing was they were thinking about getting David Bowie. They didn't show that, but that was later on. But yeah, like, I don't know.
I'm sure there was somebody who would have stepped up to be the guitarist for the Beatles, but luckily it didn't really have it happen, right? Because George I haven't seen part 2 yet, but I don't think it's a spoiler. I think he does come back to the band here, right?
Yeah.
It also ruins the whole purpose of this whole thing. Like, it's not the Beatles anymore. There's only 4 of them. It's like, you can't. It's like Van Halen. Like, is it really Van Halen with Sammy Hagar? Like, it's and Van Halen's not even on the same level as the Beatles. Like, don't tell 15-year-old me that. But you can't just take your lead guitarist, replace it with another guy, and be like, oh, it's the Beatles. Like,
yeah.
Sometimes it works, like in Babylon 5 when they had to get rid of Commander Sinclair, and then Captain Sheridan came in season 2. Sometimes it works.
Yeah, totally that.
I can't believe he slipped in a Babylon 5 here on the Beatles Get Back Part 1 podcast. Recap here with Dave Mader and Josh Shields. I just think that this episode kind of, it made me feel sad, happy. I kind of came around to, I've heard a lot of these stories about the fight at Ringo's house and everything that's with the George stuff. And I do think that if George had not become this great songwriter, if he had just stayed like a main guitarist like he was in the early days of the Beatles, I don't think any of this happens. But because he was like emerging as this really good songwriter, that's I think the main cause of the whole George thing.
Well, the fact that Paul and John didn't think that While My Guitar Gently Weeps was a good song, they were like, this, can't wait till we're done with this. He doesn't even know how to write a song. And that's like widely considered to be one of the greatest songs like he ever wrote and is ever from that era, certainly. And great guitar songs. And like, so they didn't know everything either. They're not infallible. John and Paul, I think that you see the more human side of them, I think, through this documentary series. I think that's kind of the nicest part. Other thing I wanted to mention too was, doesn't Paul McCartney, Jeff, remind you of like Kevin Smith, like with that beard?
Yeah, a little bit.
Just like they got that, the facial expressions and things, and
hey man,
and the eyebrows, just like, oh my god, like I can't stop seeing Kevin Smith in some of this Paul McCartney footage.
The one thing that's really interesting about Paul McCartney is how amazing he is at voices, and like just like his, not just his singing, but he does it a bunch of times, even in this first part where he starts speaking in like the posh British accent, and then he starts doing like different like
he was doing like Muppet voices at one point.
Yeah, he does like Muppet voices. Like, he's so good. He would have been an amazing voice actor. Like, he's so good at like.
I want to live in that universe.
Yeah,
where he was like, "Move over, Jim Henson. I'm a puppeteer now." He's like,
he can do it.
He's also singing songs.
Yeah,
he's just like, he's kind of a special guy. Like, I think Paul McCartney's a really He's still going, right? He's in his almost 80, right? Or whatever. But
Yeah, I think he turns 80 this year.
Yep,
There you
this
go.
June. So
Ringo's still going too. Don't forget about
Dude,
Ringo. Love that guy.
yeah.
He was on Craig Ferguson once, and he like performed live, and I was like super impressed that like 70-year-old Ringo was still rocking out. Like,
He's like,
and he
wait for the Shining Time Station reunion tour. It's gonna be amazing. I'm the conductor.
Ringo doesn't age. Like he's been like he's looked 60 years old for the last like 30 years. Like
Yeah.
he doesn't age. I don't know if he just tans all the time and he just has like good skin, but like compared to Paul, like Paul looks old now.
Paul's had a lot of work done, and that stuff doesn't age well.
No,
So-
yeah, he's definitely had a lot of plastic surgery. He's plastic maca, that's for sure. Okay, so I think that's it for part one, guys. We kind of said what we wanted to say here. I think until we get into part two, when they move over to Apple Studios, where they go into the basement. They're out of Twickenham, which the Twickenham stuff is looked at as one of the most miserable times in the Beatles' career. But I actually think this episode seemed like a lot of fun for the most part, except for maybe George.
Do you think they were having fun?
I think John and Paul were having fun. Ringo and George, not so much.
Ringo seems like he's pretty chill with whatever. So
Yeah, he's like, want me to play drums? Great. All right.
Yeah.
I think Ringo doesn't give a shit. Honestly, he's like, I just need to get through this, play their damn drum beats, and then I have to go.
I'm in a movie, damn it! I'm gonna be a big movie star. He throws shade at John Lennon. He's like, I saw your movie, John. You were good.
Yeah,
I want that to be me.
And how I won the war. Yeah. So it'll be exciting to kind of see them in the studio. I've already seen the second part, but it is very cool to see them actually record, whereas this is just rehearsals. So it's cool to see how they operated in the recording studio, which we don't really have. This is the only real footage of it. So stay tuned for that. Next Monday at 9:30, we will be covering that. Dave, what do we have coming up here on Super Mario Bros. Podcasting that you can tell all the fans about?
Well, if you're just catching us for the first time here on this podcast, then you will be continuing to coverage the next Beatles things. But we also do other TV shows, including Survivor season 41. We've been talking about that along with Jameel Robinson every Wednesday night. We'll be on again this Wednesday, December 1st, talk about episode 11. And they're down to the final 7, I believe, in Survivor. So if you like Survivor, check that out. We also talked about Big Brother season 23 earlier this summer, and Big Brother Canada 9 before that. So if you're in the reality TV shows, and we've also talked about different Survivor seasons as well, you can check that out in our playlists. As well as we do Marvel Cinematic Universe recaps and reactions, most recently Eternals. And we'll be covering Hawkeye and Spider-Man No Way Home when those finish their releases in the coming weeks and months to come. And additionally, what else? We have another channel called Live Long in Podcast. That's a Star Trek themed channel where we talk about Star Trek all the time, including, we just watched all of the episodes of the original series with our dad, Ted, all 79 episodes, not in order, finished that up not too long ago. And we're going to be starting a new podcast starting Monday nights on Live Long in Podcast, which is for Enterprise, which is the prequel series starring Scott Bakula from 20 years ago. So we'll be talking about that with Jodie Simpson starting December 6th. D Space 9 at 9 on Tuesday nights, where we recap D Space 9 episodes, watching all those episodes in order. We're into season 4 now. This Tuesday night, tomorrow night, we're going to be talking about Shattered Mirror, the Mirror Universe episode where Jennifer Sisko pops over to lure Jake to the Mirror Universe. Very sad. And then new episodes of Star Trek, including Star Trek Discovery. We're into season 4 now. Hey, Josh, you used to be with the Star Trek Discovery podcast. You're in the original season 1.
And then I think I watched 1 or 2 episodes of season 2, and I've had 2 kids since then. I don't have time to watch Star Trek now.
Yeah, I hear you. Season 2 was rough too, but now in season 4, a little bit better. And so we've been covering that. We're going to be covering episode 3 of season 4, 10:00 p.m. this Thursday night. Talking about that with Michael Chan and Adam Woodward and Ashley Millard. That episode is called Choose to Live, a Kuat Malat reference. And we also talked about Star Trek Prodigy and Star Trek Lower Decks. And we also did Star Trek Radio Theater very recently. Just on this Saturday night, we did our newest installment, which was kind of like a script read. We Star Trek Lower Decks. Jeff was playing Shax. I was playing Ma. So check out that live recording. We'll eventually be doing a produced version of that as well. And we also have our third channel, which is called Trivial Debates, a monthly show where we argue about movies, TV, sports, and more. We just did a show on Sunday yesterday. We had Jody Simpson hosting with Max and Dylan. Oh,
sorry.
Max and Dylan and Alex all competing. So if you like game shows and different arguments, then check out Trivial Debates as well. Okay. I think that's everything we got going on. Also, check out our cousin's podcast, Locutors of Trek.
Right.
It's another Star Trek podcast. Great thing. And then my son, Eamon, he has a podcast called Let's Talk About Fighting Games. They just recorded a new episode last night.
And you thought the Beatles were busy with all their stuff.
Yeah, move over, Paul McCartney. Wait until the Maters come to town.
The Maters we're pumping out podcasts left and right.
That's crazy.
Yeah, so stay tuned for all that. But yeah, join us next week. Get Back Part 2. We will have most likely Jake Shields joining us as well.
Yeah,
I'll make sure.
For all of us here at Super Mater Bros Podcasting, I say don't let me down and join us next week.
get back.